But you'll see the connections towards what I've just been doing and my talk sort of come up over the next 45 minutes or so. So, okay, so what am I talking about? Heritage and geopolitics, a kind of connection that doesn't often get made in academia. And I'm going to give you a sense of why I think this is a fascinating set of trends that's happening today. I'm looking mostly at Asia or Eurasia, and this is kind of the epicenter of this use of history, use of religion, culture in the 21st century. And there's a lot of tensions and kind of competitive rivalries emerging between India, Turkey, China, Iran, and so on and so forth, which I'll give you a bit of a sense of. But to start with, just to give you a sort of way into that, no doubt you're familiar with these types of images that have emerged in the last 4 to 5 years around Black Lives Matter and the Black Lives Matter movement. And what this has done, this kind of questioning of statues, has raised a really interesting discussion around complicated questions around history, or the complications of history and how that plays out in contemporary societies. And also the ways in which you try and represent complex history through material culture. These statues and monuments and so on and so forth, and the tearing of them down as political protest movements, or as what they get called as protest movements, or in terms of other ways of framing that discourse of what these ripping down of material cultures forms, is a kind of complex debate of the right and the left, and that's been played out in particular the US and a number of European countries in the last few years. It's also become the space of art and the politics of installations, both within civic spaces and kind of more established institutions such as museums. And this is about the kind of the politics of memory and forgetting, and what it is to re-remember in different ways, and how that plays out through material cultural forms, whether that's preserved forms from antiquity, or it's installations that were of the 19th century or even the 21st century, as you see in these two slides here. Now, ultimately, and this is an example from our region, is that this plays out in relation to national identities. And I think one of the interesting things about the Black Lives Matter, what it's done is it's really kind of foregrounded the idea that Black Lives Matter only when they're linked to white history. And I think that's problematic in certain ways. And you'll see what I mean by that later in the presentation. So how does this relate to contemporary national identities, contemporary national politics, and the ways in which that plays out in the left and right politics of mainstream electoral politics today? So that's kind of raised questions around the issues of how we read and how we interpret material culture. And that very much plugs into and connects with a longer analysis in academia of the relationship around monuments and national memory in particular, and national identity. So I use that word national because that's been the overarching paradigm and architecture of analysis for obvious reasons, the centrality of the nation state in the contemporary political geography of today and since the mid-19th century. And the ways in which structures get built towards commemorating, particularly in episodes of war and conflict, identities and associations with the nation. So does anybody recognize that structure there on the left? And is that new to everybody? Or anybody recognize that? That's a structure, and it's actually a pavilion to the Soviet Union and the USSR. And this one is a one which is probably more recognizable, linked to 1930s Germany. And so this is happening at a time just before World War II. So this is a centrality of sort of Nazi Germany within the German national identity. And these two monuments, using classical architectural forms of familiar motifs that speak to a national sense of collectiveness that was being propagated and being advanced by the states at that time. And for the Soviet Union, a much more kind of empire of nations. But those two statues also are kind of interesting in the ways in which they were built. Not statues, sorry, they were pavilions, but they use the iconography of statuary and monumental architecture in the context of a World's Fair that took place in 1937 in Paris, as you can see from this. So this was a few years before the outbreak of the World War II within Europe. It's obviously by then it had broken out in East Asia. But yeah, this is kind of an example of a genre of internationalism that had developed from the mid-19th century in Europe, and that's World's Fairs or Expos. And this one is kind of particularly interesting because it was an attempt to promote international dialogue at a time when hostilities were high and tensions and anxieties around what was happening in Europe at that time were on the cusp of breaking out into mass violence, as they did a couple of years later. So what that one slide tells us is the intersections between nationalism and national identity and internationalism. And there's a distinct literature on histories of internationalism and how that emerged. And so people like Glenda Slugger's work from University of Sydney have traced that as a movement and how that played out from the mid-19th century onwards and has run right through the 20th century and through to today. So in the context of the Cold War, we see the Soviet Union being represented again through a pavilion in a very, very different architectural form. So this is in 1958 in Brussels, and this was the first World's Fair that took place after the Second World War and was designed, and there was another attempt to build international cooperation, international trust, promote peace and reconciliation after that time. So this was, as I say, in 58. And this is a map of that World's Fair that took place in Brussels. And so what you see in that circle is that rectangular building being that Soviet Union pavilion. And with each World's Fair, and if you go back and look at World's Fairs histories, they've taken place in multiple countries, mostly in Europe and North America, but some in Asia, particularly in Hanoi and in Japan after World War II. They often coincide with the hosting of Olympics, and then obviously the Shanghai Expo in 2010. But this one was interesting in the sense of this was the first one after the Second World War. It's the height of the Cold War. So that pavilion that you see in the left of that circle, that oval, is the Soviet Union, that building I've just showed. And on the right, this circular structure is the United States. So it was interesting to put those two countries together because what you see in that entire park or that exposition site is the 140 countries that were represented during that 58 Expo. And they're interesting juxtaposition, the decision to put the United States and the Soviet Union right next to each other. But what was really interesting was the building they put in between, which is that lower elliptical structure you can see just below the United States, which was seen as a kind of mediator of the Cold War. And interestingly, that was the Vatican that they put there. So the Vatican being recognized as a separate state, it was an interesting decision that they thought that might deal with some of the tensions. Because what you see in these World Fairs histories are the layouts of them. If you look at the layouts of World's Fairs since the 1850s, they tell us a lot about the global politics of that moment, which regions are represented most explicitly and how these sites are laid out. And I'll come back to that a bit later. Now, if we go to this structure, that's the atomium that you see here in the middle. And this was the structure that was built specifically for the 58th World's Fair. And stands there today as a monument, and it's still there and it's still widely used and is kind of celebrated as a kind of architecture feature of the Brussels skyline today. And I think is used as restaurants and visitation centers and so on and so forth. And this has become a kind of monument of internationalism. And it was an attempt to promote, this whole World's Fair was an attempt to promote atomic energy for productive, peaceful purposes. So, for example, the French pavilion was all about promoting peaceful nuclear power. And this is obviously after the atomic bombs of World War II and the massive investments that were put into atomic testing immediately afterwards, and the anxieties of global destruction through nuclear power of the Cold War. So this World's Fair was an attempt to build those kind of push atomic technologies in the public imagination in more peaceful, productive directions. So in that respect, the atomium, as that structure is called, it stands as an example of a monument to internationalism. But does anybody really write about that in academia? There's been massive literatures on monuments around nationalism and national identity, commemoration of war, and how we romanticize particular episodes of 20th century history, particularly in Australia, around the links and towards conflict and so on and so forth, and federation, but also how that plays out in Europe in a number of countries. So why is it that internationalism doesn't get the same kind of critical attention? So what I'm setting up for you is that the need to think about the relationship between internationalism and material culture, and think about that more critically. Now, the reason why I'm suggesting that, and that's an interesting analytical relationship, is because what's happening in the Belt and Road Initiative today, which is what I'm going to talk about. When I say today, I mean the last 6 or 7 years since the launch of Idai Ilu, or the One Belt, One Road, as it was initially translated in English, and has subsequently become the Belt and Road Initiative, which I'm sure all of you have heard of. And there's been a number of presentations at ICS on that. So the analysis of Belt and Road in academia has primarily, and particularly in the first 5 or so years, gravitated around questions of infrastructure and transboundary physical infrastructures. We've started to see more literature on medical diplomacy, medical cooperation, obviously within relationship to COVID, some small literature on education and other types of connectivities that are part of the Belt and Road Initiative. But the vast majority of, particularly in the West, academic analysis focused on physical infrastructure connectivities. So pipelines, rail, road, and all this kind of capital intensive investments that were put into place, and obviously consolidated around BRI, things that were to use the metaphor of being in the pipeline before BRI was announced in 2013, both in Jakarta and Kazakhstan. So what that does, that analysis of BRI through that physical infrastructure investment, speaks to the kind of profound transformations that have taken place in China over the last 30 to 40 years. And so what we see is internationalization of that agenda of infrastructure and modernization and urbanization. So by the end of 2020, China's expressway network had reached 160,000 miles, and it surpassed the US network of highways back in 2011. And that was a time that China was only beginning to really embark on its rapid construction of over about 6,000 miles per year. So China's massive investment in roads seems to be the platform for internationalizing that, certainly pre-COVID. It's the same with rail. So in 2020, the country constructed over 145,000 kilometers, to use a different metric, of high-speed rail. And that had doubled between 2015 to 2020. And in terms of, in relation to other countries, the second largest high-speed rail network is in Spain today, with just over 4,000 kilometers, and Japan, in its much celebrated Shinkansen network, is just over 2,700 kilometers of high-speed rail. So China's 145,000 kilometers is pretty extraordinary in how it's built that over such a short period of time. We've also seen an extraordinary pathway towards urbanization. 60% of the population is now urban, 850,000 by 2019. So that means around 600,000 people were moved to cities in China over a 30-year period. Now, I give you these kind of numbers because this is often what's talked about in academia, these profound social, developmental, urban transformations and physical transformations that have been identified as kind of the discourse of the rise of China, and how Belt and Road internationalizes that and takes that forward with an economy that was slowing down. So this is kind of the mainstream analysis, academic analysis, BRI, that was in place. But what's also happened is a profound kind of shift in the ways in which China has understood its relationship towards its past. So those are slides from the Cultural Revolution, from the 66, 76 sort of period, or within that, and under sort of Mao Zedong's leadership. and the preservation of a communist culture by purging capitalist and associations with tradition. So the destroying of the four olds, the old ideas, old culture, old habits, and old customs. And obviously you see slides there of examples of the destruction of Buddhist monasteries and the material culture associated with that. But at the same time as China's been building all this physical infrastructure, it's also been investing heavily in its cultural infrastructure. So China, in a short space of time, has kind of raced up UNESCO's World Heritage League table, and is now, I think it's now joint leader to give a kind of parallel to a league table with Italy, and no doubt will become the kind of leading or the country that has the most properties on the World Heritage Site. This speaks to interesting discussions and debates about sort of civilizational centers in world history, so on and so forth. And part of that is that speaks to China's, and particularly that's become more and more important under the leadership of Xi Jinping, the China dream of great rejuvenation, and this idea of a civilizational state and a civilizational past. So in addition to World Heritage Site investments, and that's a pretty sizable investment to do that, we've also seen an incredible opening up of over 4,000 museums, or in a short period since 2010. And these are massive investments in cultural infrastructure and the preservation of cultural heritage. So that slide you see, that image you see of that museum in the center on the right-hand side is the first National Maritime Museum, which opened up in the north of coastline of China in the last few years, which kind of raises interesting issues of how China is reimagining its relationship to the sea and maritime histories in relation to the treaty port systems and a century of humiliation. So China's revisiting those histories and rewriting its history in ways that speak to a kind of a new, confident, internationally engaged China in the world today. Now, there's a body of work that's been discussing these types of shifts. Here's one example from UG, that's an ANU academic that speaks to these trends and this rise of heritage discourses in the country in the last few years. But again, much like the kind of issues I talked about earlier, what we see here is a kind of the centering of the nation as in this space of analysis, and the kind of the nation state within this kind of architecture. And I use that in metaphorical terms to think about how this past gets interpreted, and the politics of history and the politics of culture and heritage. And so what we see is that's been the dominant framework for understanding heritage, memory, museology, museums in Asia. So there's an extensive literature on the relationship of heritage politics and conservation in Asia and the Middle East that's emerged in the last 20 to 30 years. But I would suggest that a lot of that really speaks to the nation and uses the national as its kind of as its framework for analysis. And that really kind of is, you can see where you can trace the origins of that back to kind of the seminal work of Benedict Anderson, the idea of imagined communities, which has been so influential particularly in Southeast Asian historiography, and how to think the relationship between history, heritage, memory, and culture, and the modern politics and modern political dimensions of that, and how that gets used by states and other actors in the construction of national imaginaries and ideas of collective identities around that. So the work of Dennis, for example, is an important intervention that takes us beyond those ways of reading those links between heritage, identity, and geography. So what Dennis's work that looks between China and Southeast Asia and then onto Australia opens up these and kind of offers an interesting counter to that kind of dominant literature on that area. And so, as Dennis has indicated, I've kind of been thinking in the same way, but in a very different context around these kind of transnational, transcultural connections. Now, Dennis has looked at it in through certain actors and organizations and agencies that are kind of and not necessarily state actors that are driving this process and these connections. But in the ways I've been looking at it, I'm kind of thinking about it in other ways, and in particular in relationship towards this Belt and Road Initiative. And because I think there's something more interesting, or equally interesting, is what's happening within China in the ways in which it's constructing an idea of a civilizational culture and linking the contemporary identity that is China back to the civilizational past. What we're seeing today is a celebration of a history of internationalism and connectivity that's far beyond China, far beyond the geographies of modern China today. So the example of this slide is from Xi'an, which is which is a kind of shopping precinct, public space area that stretches over 1 kilometer long, which celebrates Tang history, culture, and the architecture and the cultural forms of that period within China itself, but also how that is an era that was connected to other parts of Asia, in particular Central Asia and to South Asia. So you may be able to see just in the distance there a tall structure, which is the pagoda that was built to mark the entry of Buddhism into China and the pilgrimage that was undertaken by Xuanzang, which has been influential or has been understood as highly influential in the spread of Buddhism and the entry of Buddhism into China. So the spread of Buddhism from South Asia up through the Himalayan area into China. And so China now is engaging with these transnational, trans-regional histories and transcultural histories and the ways in which Buddhism can tell their story. And that's very much part of this Silk Road narrative that's being revived under this Belt and Road framework. So this idea, to take you back to that slide, that there's a new Silk Road of the 21st century as a political economy of connectivity is giving a whole momentum to this idea of a heritage and a history and discourse of connectivity that spans continents and oceans and seas. And that's simplified into this idea of this overland and maritime Silk Road. Now that's very much an invented history. The Silk Road is an invented history from the 19th century. I won't go into the details of that, but because that's but I can give you a couple of references later that kind of unpack some of that issue. But what we've seen in the last few years, in addition to all this physical connectivity of roads, digital infrastructure, highways, rail, high-speed rail, freight rail, so on and so forth, we're also seeing all these cultural projects coming to the fore. So one of the things I sort of have been fascinated by is how that's happening. And so that's the book that Dennis mentioned that looks at the cultural aspects of BRI. And the academic analysis has understood Belt and Road as a geopolitical and geoeconomic project. So one of the reasons for picking that title is to say there's something going on here at a scale that's geocultural. This Belt and Road is also a geocultural project. And one of the ways I really have tried to identify that is to say that the Silk Road is a geocultural imagining of pre-modern histories of Eurasian connectivity. So the Silk Road, being a 19th century invention, is not a narrative of global history. It's neither a narrative of national history, or it's not a narrative of histories of empire or imperial histories. It's a narrative of Eurasian connectivity. We're all familiar with the idea of a overland Silk Road, but the maritime Silk Road started to gain currency at the end of the Cold War, as I'll give you a sense of it shortly. But what it does is set up these ideas of themes of connectivity, of cultural transmission, of intercultural, interreligious dialogue, and it's a highly romanticized depiction of 2,000 years. A lot of these books won't talk about plagues, violence. The book on the bottom right talks about empires of the Silk Road, but doesn't really get into sort of complexities of conquering and violence and mass violence and histories of prostitution and so on and so forth, or piracy. It's a lot of these books celebrate this kind of romanticized depiction of trans-regional, transcultural connectivity. And this is obviously highly productive for international cultural policy. In the space of promoting cultural dialogue for organizations like UNESCO and others today, and the ways in which governments are picking this up. So what this tells us and what this map starts to show us is, and you see there that the history of spice route and the history of the Silk Road histories. And as I said, I've just been part of a spice route seminar in Indonesia, is that this tells a story of massive kind of pre-modern global connectivities that center world history around the Eurasian landmass and the seas and the maritime geographies that surround it. So what does that tell us in relationship towards the ways in which states and governments are now using this history for productive purposes? And I use the word productive advisedly in terms of the ways in which they see this as a productive platform for cultural diplomacy, regional cooperation, and so on and so forth. And therefore, how do they see this as part of their internationalist ambitions? So to give you some examples of that, to answer those questions, what we're seeing through the last few years and through Belt and Road is an acceleration of the internationalization of Chinese agencies involved in the humanities. So if you look at the global history of heritage conservation, it's been driven by a number of countries, primarily those in Europe, and in the 20th century, United States and Canada, primarily the United States, by a number of organizations. And what we're seeing is China now entering that space. Japan has been very active since World War II in a way, particularly in Buddhist countries, as a way to kind of rebuild its relationships in Southeast Asia and with Central Asian countries. But what we're seeing is in the last few years is a rapid growth of international archaeological projects or collaborations around different parts of Asia and East Africa that are being led by Chinese universities or Chinese national associations, and National Association of Cultural Heritage, for example. And what that map doesn't show you, what those dots don't show you, is the collaborations around the maritime Silk Road and how that's also accelerating down through the East African coast and in countries such as Sri Lanka, the Maldives, and elsewhere, and in countries such as Oman. And what this graph or bar graph also briefly indicates is how this is accelerating under Belt and Road. So what the Belt and Road, or the idea of reviving the Silk Road to the 21st century, is giving a platform for this internationalization of cooperation around the shared heritage of Silk Road pasts. So this is a new kind of ways in which I think fascinating ways in which heritage is being produced and being funded and being given momentum in the 21st century. That it's no longer so much the US and European countries that are driving this, but it's now countries in Asia that are driving this. And that raises all sorts of interesting questions. Here's an example from Egypt. That's typically been a domain of European expertise. So if you go to any of the European museums, it's full of Egyptian artifacts, whether it's Germany, France, UK, or others. And so what does this mean now that China's now investing heavily in archaeological projects and collaborations, and this idea of a dialogue of civilizations along the Belt and Road partnership countries? So what we're seeing is China using this idea of a civilization and civilizational past to build bilateral connections, and using the cultural sector to do that. This is an example from Tunisia, and there's many other examples I could build. So again, this is all happening in the last 5 to 6 years. And one of the broad trends that is captured in this quote from UNESCO, because this UNESCO adds prestige to obviously these types of projects, is that, and you can read that for yourself, but what you see there from that slide is the ways in which archaeology is being linked into Belt and Road cooperation, as you can see from that final sentence. Now, the third line there mentions conducting systematic research by comprehensively utilizing remote sensing observation technologies, satellite navigation systems, and GIS systems. This is super interesting. Now, so what we're also seeing, what I got fascinating by, is the ways in which this kind of research and study of history and culture is linking into China's ambitions for the digital Silk Road, or the digital Belt and Road, as this slide tells us. This was launched at the end of 2016, but formally kind of implemented in 2017. And this is a multi-sector, again, under the Belt and Road Initiative, form of collaboration with 8 working groups. And this was conceived around the key development corridors of Belt and Road, including, most notably, I think, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And as you see there, cultural heritage and natural culture is part of that. So again, this use of history within this platform of multi-sector cooperation Now, that kind of remote sensing and digital is about, an example I gave you from Tunisia is an early example of the large-scale, high-resolution surveys that are now being conducted using satellite data. And in the age of Belt and Road, those Tunisian environments are now being described as, and I quote, lying along the western end of the ancient maritime Silk Road, an important trade route of the Roman age. So again, with this this new Belt and Road geography is, and then these types of technologies and this ability to think and research and scan and survey at the scale of Eurasia is really a kind of new ways in which we're thinking about heritage in today. And so one of the things I've been sort of arguing is that geocultural power comes from, to use that title of the book, it comes from the ability to think at that scale. So the Silk Road offers the opportunity and affords the opportunity for Chinese scholars, researchers to think at that scale of Eurasia. And what Europeans did in the context of 19th century empire was to think at the scale of Europe, of empire, the British Empire, to see those connections and write histories around Indian history, African history, within that narrative of world civilization, the collection of material cultures and languages and ethnographic material and archaeological material from the geographies of empire that then became the foundation for writing histories of world civilization and world culture. Go to the British Museum today or the Musée Guimet in Paris, and you see these narratives of world history and these discourses of civilization that very much structured around centers and peripheries and cores and peripheries and ideas of civilizational centers. And Tony Bennett's work there at ICS has been very highly influential in understanding and giving visibility to the politics of that 19th century construction of public discourses of history and culture. So the question then today is that, are we seeing something happen today similar in the ways in which China is envisaging the Silk Roads as a geography of trans-regional, trans-cultural histories and the capacities it's bringing to that through the surveying and resources it can bring to the humanities in that space? So in addition to land-based surveys that are being done by satellites, we're also seeing China invest heavily in ocean bed surveying and ocean bed LiDAR studies. So here's one of China's 3 deep water submersibles. And this is, if you can look at Google or look up on YouTube, you'll find footage of this vessel going to the deepest point of the ocean, the 10,000 meter deep or Mariana Trench in the Western Pacific, which is the deepest underwater valley on the planet. And well, how does that connect to what I'm talking about? China is also investing heavily in underwater maritime archaeology. So these are the centers in maritime archaeology that have opened in the last decade or so. And then this is in the search for shipwrecks. And this speaks to the issue of the South China Sea and the ways in which that also connects with the obviously disputed territories, but sea lanes of cooperation and shipping lines, so on and so forth. Sea lanes of communication for the 21st century and the politics of that, of the Indian Ocean and strategic choke points, so on and so forth. This claim over historical precedents and ocean geographies and the search for shipwrecks also kind of connects to that. And a number of people have been writing about that in recent years. But it also then speaks to the ways in which these become platforms for international cooperation around the geographies of maritime connectivity that are in international waters and open waters and the high seas. So again, that interface between nationalism and internationalism and the ways in which history speaks to that and the politics of that is something I don't think academia has coped with particularly well. So what this slide then tells you is that, and gives you a bit of a sense of, is that the Silk Road is not just about culture and history. In your imagination of what is the Silk Road, you're thinking about it of histories of connectivity, the things I've been talking about. But what we're seeing in the idea of a new Silk Road is the ways in which this is also being used for the 21st century connectivity. So the Digital Silk Road Alliance, the what others? Business Schools Alliance. So an idea. So this is obviously part of the branding of Belt and Road. And often, particularly within international relations theory or political science theory, this just gets discussed as soft power. But I think there's something else much more interesting going on there than just reducing it to soft power. And a good example of that is this 2019 Dialogue of Asian Civilizations, which took place in Beijing. And so the Silk Road and this idea of a shared past and shared values is being used for building formal diplomatic alliances and ties, both at the bilateral and multilateral level today through this Belt and Road architecture. So the question is, how do we conceptualize this analytically? I've kind of been also beginning to suggest that. How do we go about thinking about it? Is this just about soft power? Is it just about nation branding? Is it about internationalism, so on and so forth? And just to keep along those lines of thinking about and pull you back to some of the earlier examples I've been giving and linking in back into World's Fairs, this was the motif and the architectural motif that was used for that Belt and Road Forum that happened at the same time as that Dialogue of Civilizations in 2019, using the metaphor of the bridge, which is obviously self-explanatory in the sense of building bridges across Eurasia. And the Silk Road is often seen as a bridging of East and West. Now, that really got ignored in international coverage of the Belt and Road Forum, in contrast to the Shanghai Expo architecture motifs of the UK Pavilion in 2010. So this picture here is from the Shanghai Expo, and it's the UK Pavilion, which was widely written up in architectural magazines around the world as a great triumph of cultural diplomacy, a gift from the UK to the Chinese people. And the idea of it was that it was a seed pavilion, and each of those perspex rods that traveled from the outside to the inside of the structure contained a number of seeds, and I think it was around 40,000 or so. And these were symbolic of the biodiversity of London's parks, and so these were and the histories of botanical knowledge in the UK. That these were then these seeds were then given to schools to be planted in China. I have no idea whether that ever happened, but this was a narrative of diplomacy between the UK and the China during that 2010 World's Fair, both built into the architecture and the kind of public outreach that was then supposedly being offered and funded by the UK during that period. Now, the Golden Bridge of the Silk Road has, again, not been a similar kind of motif. And I think that idea was very much borrowed. This structure first appeared in the Milan Expo of 2015 that happened just before. These World's Fairs happen every 5 years. So just before the 2019 Belt and Road Forum. And this was built, that bridge you see is 20,000 artificial amber bricks. Inside each is a floral emblem made of silk. And I'm reading here, each from the quote from the text, each representing a country or region situated along the Silk and Maritime Silk Roads involved in the Belt and Road Initiative. And collectively, the bricks represent a scene from the Chinese phrase, "Let 100 flowers bloom," a saying used to express peaceful cultural diversity. So while much celebrated coverage of the UK's pavilion, this bridge was completely ignored in the West and didn't receive any international visibility, and let alone given any kind of credibility. But again, as I've sort of already suggested, how would you read this analytically? Is this merely soft power? Is it an attempt at building soft power? Is this about building cultural diplomacy? A lot of, for example, the Lowy Institute will talk about countries having soft power assets and soft power deficits. So the Lowy Power builds an index of soft power year on year, and its measures often is very, very clunky, built around a number of high-rise building in cities and other kind of metrics which don't really account for the complexities. And I would say that often also speaks to the kind of lack of attention to what's going on in this space. And it goes to that issue of Belt and Road being seen as a kind of geopolitical, geostrategic economic project. Whilst countries such as the UK are seen as having strong capacities in cultural diplomacy, there's somewhat of a pejorative analysis of countries such as China and India having very poor or weak cultural diplomacy, and whether you can even measure these types of kind of vectors in any way or use that terminology or language, I think is problematic in the first place, right? But it's the ways in which IR seems to think about culture, and in ways that separates it from other spheres of policy and treats culture as autonomous. It's often the language of soft power is a way that reads culture as an externality to economics, to development, to geopolitics, and certainly to the analysis of military affairs. So I guess what I'm also then saying is that what I'll give you a sense of over the next 20 minutes is also that we might also rethink some of that separation and that disconnection between these aspects of both public and private life, and the ways in which heritage, culture, identity link to other spheres of Belt and Road cooperation and China's ambitions to build internationalist connectivities and its ambitions for internationalism today. And how they link to regional architectures of security and even to world ordering. So in that respect, I'm moving around, and I'm happy to come back to questions that kind of rebuild those connections if they're not clear for you as I go through my talk. So is it really just about soft power and cultural diplomacy? Some of the themes I've been giving you of the ways in which internationalization of humanities, of investment in museums, of building civic infrastructures, of building such as that site in Xi'an, that grand mall to commemorate and mark Tang sort of dynasty histories and how those have come forward in recent years in Chinese heritage discourses. That selective reading of past, isn't that what European countries did in the 19th century and build massive monuments and structures to that? And again, as Tony Bennett's work is identified, in a sense, these are much more than just building architectural and civic spaces. This is about creating forms of citizenry and creating citizens of empire, and whether you're part of the metropole or the colonies, to use the terminology of empire. Do we read what China's doing? Obviously, we wouldn't use that kind of terminology to think about what China's doing today. But there's something interesting going on there, the ways in which ideas of citizenry are being forged to legitimize ambitions of the state and forging narratives of power in relation to history and connectivity. And also 19th century empires really went around the world conserving, restoring and collecting, as some of these examples from Southeast Asia or the Middle East exemplify. Empires were also structures through which massive amounts of artifacts and forms of material culture were being collected for museums. And that goes back to those initial slides of the Black Lives Matter and how they connect to debates around restitution and the restitution of artifacts to where they were looted, taken, stolen, whichever terminology you might prefer to use in the 18th and 19th century. Now, so what I'm suggesting here is that there are some interesting parallels to what happened, particularly in the 19th century within Europe. And do we use this kind of historical parallels to thinking through what's happening in China today in this Silk Road, Belt and Road nexus of the convergence of ambitious state policy with this rise of internationalization of humanities and the cultural sector and building histories around at that scale? But that term empire is highly loaded, as we know in academia, and hence why I was not really comfortable in using that in how I was analyzing this Belt and Road, Silk Road phenomena, and the idea of geocultural being another term that opens up, that draws these historical parallels, but opens us up to kind of new ways of thinking about that. So another way to think about this goes back to what I was saying earlier, is this idea and this literature on internationalism, and this interface between nationalism and internationalism, which I think is what we're seeing play out today through this Silk Road discourse and the Silk Road ambition and collaboration across a number of countries from North Africa to Southeast Asia. Now, there's a reasonably strong literature on. It's not nowhere near as vibrant and has reached the same critical mass as nationalism. But there's a reasonably well-developed literature on internationalism, the work of Slugger, Mazoa, Kennedy, so on and so forth. But one of the interesting books which doesn't get enough coverage is this Cultural Internationalism and World Order, and his subsequent books by Akira Irie, a Japanese scholar based in the US, who sees and saw cultural internationalism in relation to world ordering, as that title obviously indicates. So his arguments were that there are a number of ways to read the modern world order, in particular as it emerged from the 19th, 20th century, and obviously the growth and the spread of the Westphalian system, and an economic order and world order that was built around international flows of capital. But also the ways in which there was another form of internationalism, which he frames as cultural internationalism, which was particularly important at the end of the Cold War as it converged around the internationalization and cooperation around science, education, artistic culture, artistic activities, endeavors, and culture in all sorts of ways. And what he does is trace that back to the 19th century and says that was a vital aspect of 20th century globalization, and the interface between the sciences and the humanities that has set up all sorts of value regimes and links into the other aspects of world ordering that others have written about. But in doing that, he also links it to ideas of civilization and the duality of civilizational discourses of the 19th century, and the idea of a modern civilization or modern civilized nation and a modern civilized state, and a cultivated population, which was very much, as Tony's identified, and part of the 19th century practice of statecraft, and also those ideas of civilization that trace ideas of antiquity and ideas of the West that archaeology was kind of tracing as it developed in the 19th century, and anthropology, but particularly archaeology, and fields like such as philology and others. So it raises questions for how states have promoted and nurtured those ideals through the 20th century, and that the modern civilized state is a state that curates and safeguards the past. And this is what Meiji Japan learned in the 19th century, and increasingly used science and humanities to do that. And so at that time, there was these debates around race and culture, and this obviously race in particular entered a complex space and was discredited in relation to eugenics. And civilization was very much seen as a more eternal, eternal concept, despite Spengler's writing of the decline of the West around the end of the World War I, so the crisis of Western modernity and Western civilization. So what does Irie argue? That internationalists wanted to save these ideals and these ideas from the kind of politics of empire and the politics of nationalism, and that these ideals and obviously values such as that now we talk about in terms of the cosmopolitan ethos, that the internationalists of the 19th century, and as they moved through the 20th century, were committed to embedding these and exporting these to all societies around the world, and as a counter to rising militarized nationalisms and imperial rivalry. And of course, there were different forms of internationalism, so Daniel Bell's work, for example, Reordering the World, is another kind of interesting parallel to Irie's work on the spread of liberalism and internationalism in the early 20th century, and how that Anglo-American idea of liberalism took hold and through the 20th century, and obviously came to the fore through the 1980s and so forth. But what Irie tells us is how these values and ideas came to be embedded in a number of organizations, and how this was central to 20th century globalization. So what you see there is a slide from the Committee on Intellectual Cooperation, which was formed under the League of Nations, which was to promote international exchange between scientists, researchers, teachers, artists, intellectuals, which was established in Geneva in 1922 and ran through to 1946. Now, it might seem these are somewhat trivial and less consequential. You know, why is an important network of teachers important, or artists? But these were central to promoting all sorts of fields of expertise around the world. And obviously, we've seen that the globalization of multiple areas, whether it's medical developments and so on and so forth, but these types of networks that were formed over the 20th century is what IDEA is pointing to and saying these were central to the interconnectivities that we're all now so familiar with. So in 1926, the International Institute of Intellectual Cooperation was established in Paris to support this Geneva Committee. And this had members such as Marie Curie, Einstein, and that's what this picture is from, this Institute of Intellectual Cooperation. So one of the debates then is that did this international network and these types of network that were formed over the course of the 20th century, were they failures in world ordering? How did they lose out to the more sort of other forms of world ordering that we're more familiar with? So that's one of the things he's tried to understand. Now, as I say, what we see then is that that link between 19th century associations between culture and civilization. So often we talk about culture in somewhat contained ways today, but what it's easy then to forget than the ways in which culture was talked about in the late 19th century and early 20th century, which linked it to ideas of civilization and civilizational pasts and how dominant those narratives were in thinking about history and culture and ideas of East and West. So this is a couple of slides from the League of Nations archives in Geneva. And those ideas of culture and civilization were very much central to the internationalization of science and education, and the belief, therefore, of the universalism of science, and how those were central to the ideas of setting standards around science. One of the first projects of the League of Nations was to introduce the passport, and these are kind of documents we all take for granted together. But there's obviously this allowed protocols of international mobility that we all take for granted today, but also the internationalization of weights. And it's not very easy to see on this slide, but on that right-hand side, sort of midway down, what we see then is this kind of the first steps towards international protocols and universalist beliefs in how history should be studied through the increasingly scientific languages of archaeology. And this was the first step towards setting global norms around these fields, which became kind of much more embedded and entrenched after World War II through organizations such as UNESCO and get embedded in international cultural policy. So what we also see then is internationalist ideas that are also, and these ideals that these agencies and these experts and these networks of experts were promoting through the early decades of the 20th century. Also the ideas of civilized people, which is an interesting concept, right? And civilization always has its other, the idea of the barbarian. And I guess what I'm also then prompting you to think about is, what does that mean when China's talking about the dialogue of civilizations today? Who are the barbarians that it's excluding? Maybe it's the United States, maybe it's the UK, maybe it's Australia. But what I'm showing you there is a slide from the League of Nations. And from that slide there, you can see in kind of what the font that's sharpened is the kind of the complex, fascinating, and why I was doing research there, the kind of the interface between of the interwar period and the League of Nations mandate period, and the kind of the early decades of the Zionist movement of the 20th century, and how countries such as Russia were getting involved. And building, and how these ideas interface between nations and these complex histories were being embedded in these international organizations such as the League of Nations, and how they then set up a complex relationship that plays itself through the 20th century. And you'll see why I come back to that shortly. Because all those complexities around Russian history that then get embedded in the Soviet Union, to the transnational Zionist movement of the formation of Palestine, that then becomes the massive complexity of Israel after World War II. And this is a slide from the formation of UNESCO in 1945, and the commitment to cultural internationalism and the ways in which these kind of complicated forces in play that underpin and undergird this internationalist rhetoric that is so celebrated today and gets promoted by these organizations, and get promoted through the kind of cooperation frameworks that are about promoting education, science, and culture. So UNESCO is a United Nations agency to promote international collaboration around those three themes of education, science, and culture. And again, this is central to IDEA's work on saying that these networks and these building of these networks has been part of the kind of world ordering of the 20th century. And it's a world ordering that's not about competing nation states. It's about understanding globalization as networks, connections, flows and routes in all sorts of ways. So one of the ways in which UNESCO tried to do this, everybody focuses on World Heritage, but one of the ways in which UNESCO tried to do this at the end of the Cold War was this idea of celebrating the Silk Road as a trans-regional, trans-cultural history that spreads right across from East Asia and Japan right through to the Mediterranean and down, as you see, down to Southeast Asia and the eastern coastline of Africa. So this was a project that UNESCO ran between 1988 and 1997. It was initially developed for 5 years, and then because of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, there was a lot of anxiety around what does this mean for East and West relations? How do they need to be rebuilt? So the Korean Peninsula was still a hotbed of political anxiety and militarization. And so the Silk Road offered a way to think about futures based on more harmonious pasts. And this was the language that UNESCO was pushing. And what it did then was to promote and generate a lot of international visibility, not just about these histories, but about the kind of shared pasts of science. And what I mean by that is kind of shared histories of navigation and technologies that moved along these trade routes over many centuries. So this history of connectivity was about showing the histories of connectivities of learning and teaching, the transmission of ideas, the transmission of cultures and religions. And obviously, we hadn't yet got to the point of the clash of civilizations discourse of Huntington and the post-Cold War era. That was a lot of political theory coming out of the United States, which was now setting up a new kind of geopolitical tension around Islam and the West. But this was about anticipating new futures based on more harmonious paths at the end of the Cold War. And this therefore was played out through saying that, well, if we trace these histories of connectivity and transmission and a harmonious pre-nation state histories through architecture, art, culture, religion, so on and so forth, this is a platform for building peace and intercultural and international cooperation, which is UNESCO's ambition as an intergovernmental agency at that critical time of restructuring world international affairs and world affairs at the end of the Cold War. Now, that then takes up interesting dimensions through the 2000s, 1990s and 2000s on the back of 9/11 and the UN Dialogue of Civilizations and the Iranian government take this up, this language of connectivity and Silk Road and civilizational dialogue as an attempt to counter what was happening in kind of Western political thought and obviously events in relation to 9/11 and so on and so forth, and what was happening in Afghanistan and Iraq in the early 2000s. So all of this kind of feeds into those internationalist ambitions to kind of counter this kind of militarized nationalism that we've seen all the way through the 20th century and certainly into the early decades of the 21st. But to jump you forward to today and bring you back to Belt and Road, because I'm looping you back through the early 20th century and back to today, is to say that some of those trajectories that I've traced is what we're seeing play out today in China's Belt and Road Initiative and the cultural aspects. So there's a small literature on China's influence in the UN, and there's some interesting publications around that, academic work being done around that. And the slide you see here is from the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, or DESA. This is the main documentations entity, produces many of the documents for the United Nations, including the UN General Assembly. And interestingly, over the last 13 or 14 years, the last 3 directors have been Chinese diplomats and technocrats. And so what this tells us is a good example of how China is embedding, for better or worse, and I'm certainly not putting judgment on that, its influence in the UN system and shifting the language of the UN and the discourses and the agendas of the priority of the United Nations in a way that doesn't mean to say throwing in lots of money and certainly not leading highly intensive or capital intensive military campaigns, but shaping the discourses of the organization in interesting influential ways. So, and as well as the kind of literature that on DESA and how other agencies of the UN are being shaped by non-Western countries, this pie chart here shows you the ways in which East Asian countries, in particular Japan and China, are now shaping the funding structures of the UNESCO as an organization. So this is profoundly different to where we were even two decades ago, but certainly it's very different, a long way away from where we were 4 or 5 decades ago after the formation of UNESCO after World War II, where most of the money was coming from European and the United States. So that pie chart is in profound contrast to that slide that I gave you right at the beginning, which is shown here again, which is from the League of Nations. And when I was there, I was fascinated to see that there was one entry for China and its role and its relationship to the, so in their archives, China's engagement in the League of Nations was entirely negligent, and how that's shifted to where we are today, a century later. So how does all that kind of relate to, again, back to Belt and Road? Well, and that kind of issues of internationalism and that trajectory of internationalism from the 19th century through the League of Nations, through the UNESCO and other organizations. And what EDA shows is that post Cold War, this network of agencies that were committed to internationalization and cooperation across multiple sectors dramatically expanded, and it became even more important to world ordering questions after the end of the Cold War. So we can actually go to Iran to kind of think through some of these issues of the ways in which states play and shape this internationalization and these commitments to internationalism today, and the values that get embedded in the ways that Duncan Bell was showing for the early 20th century. How is China sort of influencing that today? So here's an example, which again, you might have heard about in the last few years, or last 12 months, the $400 billion deal, which again connects to a lot of publicity around in Western media around the sanctions that the US was putting on Iran, and the ways in which the Iranian government turned to China and signed this massive $400 billion deal, which was largely secretive, that ran across multiple aspects of the Iranian economy, including the cultural sector, and was partly to build people-to-people connections from China down through the Middle East. Now, again, would you just merely identify the cultural aspects as purely soft power or the cultural diplomacy? This is a slide of the digital infrastructures that China's been building and is now rolling out through Belt and Road partner countries. So this is an ecosystem of payments and setting up international financial structures. Now, one of the ways in which Iran is being punished by the US in recent times has been kind of the closing off of its international payments, its ability to receive and move money across international borders through the SWIFT systems. So one of the ways in which you invoke sanctions is to close that international payment system down. So I think China's obviously very aware of that. So Iran and this $400 billion deal is seen as one of the first experimental rolls out of these kind of ecosystem of international finance that is going to be, I think, one of the key platforms of cooperation for Belt and Road over the coming years, and is certainly part of the digital Silk Road ambition that China's pushing forward and really increased since COVID has happened, and the physical projects have slowed down. So how does that relate to this stuff, these kind of cultural sites? Well, China has this incredible asset, and that's a outbound tourism industry. And pre-COVID-19 had by far the largest outbound tourism industry at 140 million Chinese tourists that were crossing the borders per year. And tens of millions of Chinese tourists are now visiting cultural sites and museums around the world. In 2020, less than 15% of the Chinese population held a passport, a figure that's predicted to double over the next decade. So a lot of where this is, I think, is going to go to these sites. A lot of these Chinese tourists are going to be going to these sites, and other tourists from around region, from not just China, but from other countries in the region. And these sites are the locations that have been identified by ICOMOS, and ICOMOS is the advisory body to UNESCO and for its cultural sites, as Silk Road properties. And there's 3 colors there. The blue ones are those 33 locations that became a World Heritage Silk Road site in 2014. And the green ones are the sites that are already on the World Heritage list that could be renominated as Silk Road properties. And the red ones are sites that are on the tentative lists. And again, for those who are not familiar, the tentative lists are the kind of wish lists that are put together by governments around the world of those places they want to have on the World Heritage list in the coming years. And therefore they build ambitions to put that in place domestically. So when you look at the Belt and Road geographies that are happening, and these are economic corridors, what we see is a distinct overlap between those Silk Road sites, cultural sites, and the kind of developmental corridors of Belt and Road. So this is where, you know, kind of the new forms of investment, whether it's hotel zones, airports, roads are being built around these kind of cultural sites. And that's a story of heritage sites all across Asia the last 30 years. So for countries such as Iran, here's a slide that shows where their how they've thought about their World Heritage lists. And so the darker dots, if you can make that out, are the ones that are already on the World Heritage list, and the lighter dots are the orange dots are the ones they want on their tentative list. And the purple is what ICOMOS is suggesting they could become Silk Road properties. So what this does is rethink Iranian history, not to think of it as part of just a Persian empire, but think about it as connected to China. So this has kind of really interesting ideas and implications for rewriting both Eurasian history and world history. The Silk Road narrative becomes its history of narrative and connectivity that kind of shapes where Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan sit within the narratives and stories of world history in the public imagination. This is a example from Chuanzhou, which became a World Heritage Site in July of this year. And this is now being kind of linked to the idea of this maritime Silk Road, which is a sort of maritime parallel to the Silk Road, to the overland Silk Road. And this is putting in place now a big kind of momentum around building cooperation around and international connections around maritime Silk Road heritage and histories of connectivity. And if you go to many of the speeches in the Boao Forum and others in the World Heritage Committee meeting, which China hosted in July of this year, China's international engagement with its regional partners is now being promoted around this kind of maritime geography in a very, very explicit way. And that raises interesting questions of how do we rethink maritime history and heritage? And where does this take heritage discourses away from the nation state? So go back to those slides where I showed you the books that are written on heritage in Asia. They don't kind of really relate to what's happening today and how we need to think about where this is, where these governments are taking and these international agencies are taking heritage discourses today in the political economy of connectivity, which is the Belt and Road and its alternatives, which are being produced by countries such as India and others. And there's also a kind of increasing interest to think about civilization through maritime geographies. So do we think about maritime regions as civilizational zones? Now that's a kind of map of bubbles that you don't think maybe is that kind of, you know, maybe it's an academic exercise, but it's also a kind of way in which this international cultural policy that's being built by a new multi-city, 26-city alliance that's being built within China for international cooperation and cooperation within China, which is the Maritime Silk Road City Alliance. And so this is now a platform that's coming into operation that's about building connections both within the country and across other countries between universities, cultural agencies, governments, city governments, provincial governments, and national governments around this maritime Silk Road geography. And it opens up questions about how do we think about these relationships between heritage history and identity today. So there's obviously the questions of what is maritime heritage, how does it relate to the salvaging of stuff off coastlines and the massive amounts of money that can be made from that. So that kind of raises interesting questions about the illicit trafficking of maritime artifacts. I've got a PhD student working on that here in Perth. That's looking exactly that. How does the Maritime Silk Road create new discourses of value that leads to new forms of illicit trafficking? How do we rethink, again, some of the themes that Dennis is really working on, connections across seas and different geographies of land around maritime Buddhism that enters into cultural policy in a way that wasn't there 5 years ago. So Belt and Road is kind of driving these discourses and these kind of ideas to think about history in interesting ways, and maritime Islam that connects to the Arab world. It raises interesting questions about how we think about world history. So interesting relationships between culture and nature, and histories of navigation that countries have kind of not really thought about in terms of their own identity and their own place in world history in the past. So why is any of that important? Well, because it crosses all these boundaries of international cultural policy. So this becomes part of the platform of internationalization around which these kind of networks of expertise, I think, will converge in science, education, culture, all these kind of ways in which networks were built in the 20th century. What we're seeing through the Silk Road Belt and Road Nexus is kind of and this idea of a maritime Silk Road and maritime geographies that will enter into these kind of cultural policy frameworks that are being promoted by UNESCO and other organizations. It's also a focal point for forms of bilateral cooperation. So here's one example from Sri Lanka. The maritime archaeology is seen as a maritime heritage diplomacy is seen as a part of a vital form of collaboration between Sri Lanka and China, with Sri Lanka being a key partner of the Belt and Road framework. So for Iran, as I mentioned, it's another way to think about Iranian histories. I gave the example of how they're rethinking their land-based history, but I've been to seminars in Iran where they're thinking about, okay, where do we see ourselves within world history? For the West, it's kind of this failed state, and since well, not necessarily failed state in the sense of Afghanistan, but since the Islamic Revolution, it's moved further and further away from kind of the values that the West would like to promote through international cooperation, such as democracy, liberal capitalism, so on and so forth. So where does Iran figure into this internationalization that's being led by China today? How does it figure in? How do these histories figure into this international cooperation framework? And equally, how does this figure into the kind of tensions of the Middle East? And how does Iran get visibility to push these types of history and connectivity, which, and I won't go into now, but also countries such as Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and others also kind of have ambitions for telling these stories of expansive geographies of regional, cultural, and religious influence that kind of expand much further than the modern nation state. So but also then links to the ideas of conservation and the funding and the international money that goes into that, and the ideas of preserving structures, which much more than just about preserving temples and structures, which has been the focus for 20th century heritage. How does this now provide a platform for all this kind of money that flows into conservation? And who's funding that? So which countries are funding that conservation? So therefore, which narratives get foregrounded, which projects get foregrounded in countries such as Afghanistan? Is it Buddhist heritage? Is it a history of Persian connectivity? Is it a history of Islam, so on and so forth? Because agencies in the Middle East will have different agendas to those in Europe. Boris Johnson celebrates histories of civilizational links to Palmyra, so on and so forth, in the way that Qatar wouldn't if it's funding projects. And this is an example from a museum exhibition in Abu Dhabi. And this obviously a key driver of this is tourism and the driving forces of tourism. So Maritime Silk Road is becoming a platform for creating big capital investments of tourism. So I was going to events in Turkey before COVID, which were promoting infrastructure projects in the Black Sea region about promoting Chinese tourism. And this is all about Silk Road histories and showing the connectivities that connect the Mediterranean and the Baltic, so up to the Baltic states, but also the Black Sea regions to show histories of connectivity, which is about attracting these Chinese tourists on this massive scale. So you can see countries are investing and building infrastructure to do that. Dennis, do I need to wrap up in a few minutes? You're on mute. I can't hear you, Dennis. You're on mute.
Yeah, that would be because I'm on mute, yes. Yeah, that would be good, Tim, to wrap up pretty soon.
Okay, I'll keep going for another couple of minutes. This is just to say India is producing its own rivalries to this Belt and Road, which is about its own maritime geographies, and it's pushing its own maritime histories of connectivity. I just mentioned Indonesia. That's doing the same. So it's pushing this spice route because it's nervous around the ways in which these kind of histories of connectivity are being promoted. And to go to the Himalaya, histories of Buddhist connectivity are also being part of this cultures of international connectivity that China and India are now competing over. So there's an interesting book here you might sort of pick up, how we think about the Himalaya, not the Himalaya today, but I was linking the Himalaya today to the ways in which the League of Nations, and this book shows how the Alps in Europe were central to the ethos of internationalism in the early 20th century, and the ways in which that became central to the ambitions of internationalists in the 20th century, and how we might be seeing what's going on in the Alps, in the Himalayas today, and the ways in which Buddhism is seen as this internationalist kind of history of connectivity that China and India are competing over, but supposedly collaborating over. So I'll finish there. And part of that, I did have other slides on COVID, but I won't go into that. That links you back to science and so on and so forth, and traditional medicine. But I'll leave it there. But I guess what I'm getting at is this interconnections between internationalization of networks of cooperation around education, science, history, culture, heritage, that also feed into each other and connect to each other, that whereby we've got embedded ambitions of national expansion and national influence in regions, in respective regions, but we use that language of internationalism. And so how do we think about that as a politics, as a field of politics, as a kind of complex interface between nationalism and internationalism in the kind of 21st century? And I think I will just give you one final point, which was to say that go back to UNESCO. What we see here then is a lot of these countries that are kind of investing very heavily into this and driving these types of ambitions for collaboration and connectivity, and using the kind of prestige of organizations such as UNESCO. And what I think is that maybe this will have a kind of potentially a more kind of impact over the next decade or so, or longer, than perhaps even the Black Lives Matter, in terms of identifying issues around social justice of history and memory, because this is a conversation that's happening in the US and is linked to white history. What it doesn't do, and what these organizations such as the Getty, who were very influential in driving international heritage and culture and conservation in the 20th century, and I've spoken to some people like these organizations. So this is a Getty that's based in Los Angeles and has worked on many Asian countries, and people there saying, well, now because of Black Lives Matter, we're now investing in our kind of understanding our histories and representation of the past within urban environments, and the history of California, which is where the Getty is located. And so that's a domestic conversation for obvious and understandable reasons. And similarly, a lot of museums in Europe are kind of going through this language and this discourse of decolonization. What does it mean to decolonize museums? So what I'm getting at is that whilst countries such as India and China have this kind of now this outward-looking ambitious internationalization program, a lot of Western cultural sectoral organizations are kind of somewhat turning inward. They don't have the funds because of COVID, and they're having this reflexive discussion about their own social history, or their own histories linked to social justice and memories of empire. And so yes, they're talking about slave routes. But what's interesting is that this is a museum in Qatar that's kind of looking at global slave histories and kind of bringing new narratives into the public history at a global level that opens up ways in which to think about these complex histories of empire, trade, slavery, spice, cotton, coffee histories, and the exploitation and extraction of those histories, or the industries and the historical implications of that, and how we feed that into international cultural policy today. So where the West might be retreating in some of those spaces, I think there's interesting conversations that's going on and being driven by, even by something like the Belt and Road Framework, that puts kind of this into international cultural policy in a way that's not being picked up in academia in the way it might be. So that's where my head is, and that's why I'll wrap it up there, and leave. I hand it over to you, Dennis.
Actually, over to you, Jan. Jan is